So, without much further ado, I'm very pleased to invite Roger Musson, whom you will see much more in the handbook. We have the CDs and abstracts for the talk, so I won't lose your time by saying you will find it. Roger, of course, is well known as a national seismological historian. He just given the Mill Managed Lecture from the Society, and I'm very pleased to invite him to give this talk, which is Early British Thinking on Earthquakes from Shakespeare to Hooke.
Thank you very much. I hope this works. Yes, it does. Right, as professional seismologists, we are most of us used to being called upon to explain what an earthquake is to ordinary people. And I would like to ponder what would happen if it was the other way round. Supposing, after the end of this conference, we went into Leicester, and went to Leicester Market here, and stopped some ordinary people, and asked them, could they please explain to us what an earthquake is? What sort of answers would we get? I suspect that we would probably get quite a variety of opinions, and I suspect probably that some people would confuse earthquakes with volcanoes, and I hope that some people would give some reasonably accurate answers. But what I'm going to suggest is that supposing we also had the resource of a time machine, and supposing we used that time machine and went back to Elizabethan England and asked the same question, then we know what the answer would be. And the reason that I think we can work that out is because of these two gentlemen. So this is a scene from Shakespeare's Henry IV, Part 1, Act 1, Scene 3. This is from a recent BBC production, and there is Hotspur on the left and Early Glendower on the right. The purpose of this scene, in terms of play, is to send up Glendower as a Welsh windbag. And my apologies to any Welsh people here, but in Elizabethan theatre, if you wanted to get a cheap laugh, then an easy way to do it was to poke fun at provincial stereotypes. So Glendower is trying to persuade Hotspur that he is in fact a wizard. He has supernatural powers, and as a token of this, at the moment of his birth, there was an earthquake. And Hotspur is having none of this. He says, don't be stupid. Earthquakes are a natural phenomenon, and we understand them. Learn how earthquakes happen. And this is what he says, which is rather interesting. So this is the actual speech. And I'll pass over for the moment the fact that it's interesting to see that Shakespeare had a fine appreciation of seismic vulnerability. He realized that steeples and moss-grown towers are the first things to come down. But what he's saying here is essentially that earthquakes are caused by the violent eruption of subterranean wind from the bowels of the earth. This is Aristotle's explanation of earthquakes. And it is effectively that earthquakes are the earth farting. A biological analogy that was certainly not lost on Shakespeare, nor on his audience, nor for that matter on Aristotle. So what I want to say here is that Shakespeare was in the business of entertaining his audience. He wasn't there to educate them. And if you've got an unruly crowd of theatre-goers to entertain, you don't entertain them by lecturing them on stuff that they don't know. So the fact that this is, he says all this about earthquakes, tells me that this was actually common knowledge in the Elizabethan period, and that an educated London theatre-goer was expected to know this. So why is it that Aristotle was the scientific orthodoxy? It had been ever since medieval times. And this is sort of rather curious. Why was it that science, of course it wasn't called science then, but if you were interested in studying the natural world, then all you did was you read Aristotle. That was the truth. Now why was that so? It was so because early on in the medieval period, it was decided that, in the teachings of the church, that God, in his infinite wisdom, decided that it would be for the benefit of mankind if people understood how the natural world that they lived in worked. And therefore he divinely revealed scientific knowledge to Aristotle for the benefit of all subsequent generations. So this was the word of Holy Mother Church, and disagreeing Holy Mother Church with Holy Mother Church was something that came with a health warning. And the fact that there was a Protestant Reformation didn't make much difference, because by the time people converted to Protestantism, this had been orthodoxy for hundreds of years, and nobody had any reason to challenge it. Exactly. Given that the Jews were God's chosen people, why exactly he should pick Aristotle, who was a Macedonian and long predated Jesus Christ, it's a bit odd, but there we go. So anyway, this was scientific orthodoxy. You couldn't challenge it until Galileo came along. And what Galileo did was he was the first person to incontrovertibly demonstrate that Aristotle could be wrong about something through his astronomical observations. And once you prove that Aristotle is wrong about one thing, then you can no longer maintain that Aristotle was divinely inspired. So he could be wrong about anything. And this must have been, this was absolutely revolutionary. That one crack in the Aristotelian edifice, it was like a dam bursting. It only takes one crack. And it must have been astonishing to be alive at that time, and be an educated person, because you wake up in the morning and you suddenly find that everything you thought you knew is wrong. And in the first case, that must be terribly disorienting, that everything you took as a certainty that you can't rely on any longer. But also, it must have been incredibly exciting, because suddenly everything is out there to be discovered. Everything, you've got to study it anew. So how did so how do you do this? Now, at that time, you couldn't rely on universities, because universities were principally educational establishments. So what happened was that men of learning came together in scientific societies. In Italy, in France, in Britain being the Royal Society, and to a lesser extent in Germany. And it was these learned societies that drove forward the redevelopment of science. And if you look at some of the very early papers from things like the Royal Society, then you get a sense of the enormous ferment of ideas that was going on. You find papers that nobody would consider publishing today. Things appearing in the Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society on two-headed calves. Nobody's interested in two-headed calves now, but in those days, people didn't know what was important. Therefore, everything was potentially relevant. So that also, of course, meant that you had to re-examine earthquakes and discover what an earthquake is. So the problem, there's a difficulty here, and that is that earthquakes are a VSLP. Everybody knows what a VSLP is? So it is a very short-lived phenomenon. And these things are inherently difficult to study, because you don't know where they're going to, you don't know where they're going to happen, you don't know when they're going to happen, they don't last for very long, and they're essentially infrequent. So you're stuck more or less with anecdotal evidence on which to base your ideas. And a modern example is ball lightning. People still don't really understand what ball lightning is. For exactly this reason. It doesn't last long, it's rare phenomenon, and you don't know where it's going to happen. So earthquakes are an example, and here is a good case in point. John Wallace. John Wallace was an Oxford mathematician. His mathematical work is what he's best known for. He was also a prominent in the history of cryptography, and he was a fellow of the Society, of the Royal Society, of course. Everybody of consequence was. And one evening, on the 19th of January 1666, a nasty cold wet evening, he was sitting in his study in Oxford, and suddenly the room started shaking, and he made the assumption that most people do in Britain when they feel an earthquake. They said, oh, there must be some heavy traffic in the street outside. By the time he realized that it wasn't traffic, and it was in fact an earthquake, it was over. It was very short-lived. So what did he do? He did something that was really quite remarkable, because it was something unique in the history of science. He attempted to make an instrumental observation. This was the first time that anybody had ever attempted to gather instrumental data for an earthquake. Only problem, wrong instrument. What he had available was a barometer. So, when a modern seismologist reads Wallace's paper, you can more or less hear them screaming down the centuries, forget our bloody barometer, it's no use, tell me something useful. But Wallace didn't know that it wasn't the right instrument, because he had no idea what an earthquake was. For all he knew, barometric evidence might have actually been crucial. And the reason for this is this fundamental difficulty that existed at that period, which we've well settled now, and that is, where does an earthquake actually come from? Does the shaking originate from above, or does it originate from below? Now, we know that it comes from underground, so it seems obvious to us. It wasn't obvious in the 17th century, because an earthquake quite often resembles something like thunder. It's a valid hypothesis that it could be an electrical phenomenon originating in the atmosphere, in which case your barometric data is quite significant. Or John Flamsteed, who was the first astronomer royal, he made the very acute observation that earthquakes are felt more on the upper floors of buildings than on the ground floor, which is true, and then made the totally incorrect deduction that this indicated that earthquakes originated somewhere up in the atmosphere. So that brings me to Hooke, of course. And if I don't mention Hooke, then Aftab will not be happy. So here is a modern painting of Robert Hooke that isn't any contemporary portrait of him. He was not just a fellow of the Royal Society, he was actually their curator of experiments. So if some member of the society said, well, you know, it would be interesting if we could try doing this, then it was Hooke who was expected to find the resources to actually do that. He was also the surveyor for the City of London after the Great Fire, so a very practical individual, and he had wide scientific interests. That more or less goes without saying here, because at that period there was not enough known about any one subject to occupy a person for their lifetime, so everybody was expected to sort of look at a wide range of things. Now, Hooke's position in the history of seismology is rather interesting, because look at this. This is a very nice wall chart that you can get from IRIS. History of seismology, and it's very up to date. It goes down to interferometry here, shape maps. And where does it start? Oh, yes, there's Bohm, there's Mallet, there's Richter. It's very comprehensive. Where does it start? It starts here. It starts with Hooke. So why is Hooke the beginning of the history of seismology? Well, this is what it says on the IRIS website. Seismology's rich history begins with Robert Hooke's 1676 paper titled True Theory of Elasticity or Springness. Now, this is true in the sense that modern seismological theory relies a lot on elasticity. But it's a little bit ironic because this 1676 paper doesn't actually mention earthquakes at all. So what IRIS are effectively saying is that the history of seismology begins with something that's not actually about earthquakes. And this is all more ironic because Hooke actually was interested in earthquakes. And he published another paper called Lectures and Discourses of Earthquakes. And what do you suppose but so you've got elasticity without earthquakes, and you've got earthquakes without elasticity. So given that where if seismology begins with Hooke, what does Hooke actually say about earthquakes? Well, this is also rather interesting. Hooke was interested in earthquakes because he was interested in fossils. And there are many routes into seismology. But via paleontology is one that is effectively rather unusual. And the question that Hooke was asking was this: how is it that you can go up a hill and look at the rocks at the top of the hill and you find fossils that are quite obviously marine organisms? Seashells. How did they get from under the sea to the top of the hill? So that was a bit of a problem. And for Hooke, he didn't have the same perspective on geological time that we have today. So he needed some way of getting seashells off the seafloor up and out in a reasonably short time, which meant pretty much violent earth movements. So he was saying, well, it must be earthquakes. This is the way to get things from the seabed up to the top of hills. But what he was thinking of in terms of earthquakes is very much that rather treacherous Latin word terremotus, which is the Latin for earthquake, but it's rather ambiguous term because it can also mean a landslide. It's anything that involves displacement of earth, which is what Hooke is interested in, because all he's concerned about is how did the fossils get to the top of hills. And in his paper, he gives accounts of earthquakes, examples of earthquakes. And the examples that he gives are partly major earthquakes abroad that he had read about that did involve large earth displacements. They're partly volcanoes, and they're partly landslides. But earthquakes in terms of a shaking phenomenon, he wasn't interested in that at all. So, that poses the question, who was the first person who did put together, on the one hand, elasticity, and on the other hand, earthquakes? But it is somebody who has in common with Hooke that there is no authentic portrait of him. Unlike Hooke, there is no inauthentic portrait. So he's the mystery man there. And his name was John Mitchell. And John Mitchell was he was a Cambridge man. He was professor of geology in the 1760s. And then he retired to a little village of Thornhill in Yorkshire and lived a life, an extremely tranquil and undisturbed life, writing papers of unsurpassed scientific brilliance. And he became interested in earthquakes after the major 1755 Lisbon earthquake. And reading the accounts of that, he made the deduction, the historic deduction, that the only possible explanation that fitted all the details was that earthquakes were, in fact, elastic waves traveling through the rocks, and they were radiating out from a subterranean focus. And he drew the conclusion from this, the very radical conclusion from the time, that this means you can actually locate an earthquake if you have sufficiently accurate measurements of the arrival times at different places. In fact, at that time, the time measurement was not sufficiently accurate to be able to really do that, but he writes that if we could measure time accurately, then we could deduce not only the location of an earthquake, but also the velocity of the elastic waves in rock. This was really quite revolutionary. Nobody had ever thought of earthquakes before as something you could locate in a practical sense. If you believe that an earthquake is actually a sort of an electrical discharge, it's like a thunderstorm, then like a thunderstorm it probably drifts around the country. And the idea of locating it to a single point of origin is something that just wasn't considered. So, if I turn to the first detailed written history of seismology, compiled by Charles Davison in 1927, Davison's work on and what he writes about the early period of seismology consists of before Mitchell, Mitchell, and after Mitchell. And if that is not a tribute to Mitchell's importance, then I don't know what is. So this is really where seismology starts, with Mitchell. So, so I've been a little cheeky here. One of the things that Mitchell he was so imaginative that back in the 18th century, he conceived that it was possible that black holes existed. And if you were to ask an astronomer or a physicist, when was the first appearance of writing about black holes, they would be unlikely to guess that the idea was thought of in the 18th century. So I'd like to leave you with the thought that if he was the first person to suppose the existence of black holes, given that amount of imagination, if we could bring his spirit into this room, then he would be quite interested in helioseismology. So, thank you very much.
Thank you, Roger, for that very delightful introduction. Are there any questions?
I think there were some parallel developments in Italy where earthquakes were of great social concern because of the damage, and so they started recording them with pendulums and buckets of sand, the peg in the sand, and trying to get the direction the earthquake was coming from by perpendicular to the horizontal motion.
They did, yes. That was a bit later because the first Italian pendulum seismometers are around about, I think, the 17th, 18th century, so they're after Hooke. Also, I've heard it said that one of the things that was done in Italy, if you didn't happen to have a large pendulum with a bit of chalk underneath it, you could use a bowl of thick soup. And when the earthquake happened, then the soup would slosh up on one side of the bowl. And then you could see from the mark on the bowl left by the soup exactly the direction that the earthquake would come from. And I have come across a very obscure paper written by a British person who was living in Portugal at the time of this one earthquake, and he suggested a variation on that, whereby you got a bowl and you covered the inside with chalk dust, and then you put water in the bowl. And it was the same idea, that if the water sloshed up, then you could tell the direction from where the chalk dust had been washed away.
Okay, I'm not sure who was chairman.
The Chinese have a way of detecting the direction of earthquakes using dragons around the globe.
Yes, wonderful seismoscope of Shangzheng, which is sort of course, much earlier. But what they didn't, and I'm really looking here at more the history of theoretical seismology, or thinking about earthquakes rather than simply recording the fact that they happened.
I think this was an idea to give the direction as well, because the dragons were placed all around the bowl, and whichever ball came out gave the...
Yes, supposedly it told the emperor which part of his domain the earthquake occurred in. But that, I would say that and the case of the Italian pendulums is just the direction something's come from is not the same as actually locating by triangulation. So Mitchell was still the first person to think of locating an earthquake as a point source. Because even if you considered, as Flamsteed did, that an earthquake was a sort of explosion of combustible gas in the upper atmosphere, you could still, if you were well to the north of it, then you could say, well, the earthquake came from the south. And even if it's the idea of an earthquake like a thunderstorm moving across the country, again, you can still have the idea of a direction, even if you don't have a point source. And one of the things that you see in some of the early writings about earthquakes is that if people felt an earthquake in Britain, and then they read in their news sheet that there'd been an earthquake in Austria, then they would put two and two together. They would say, oh, well, the earthquake, maybe it started in Austria and then it moved to Britain. Probably the same earthquake. And this idea of an earthquake as a long-lasting phenomenon that moves around like a storm is surprisingly long-lasting, actually. I have seen a newspaper account published in the 1920s which suggested the earthquake started at one point and then moved southwest and then ended somewhere over here.
It was the same question. And lots of other people have the same question.
Did Mitchell do any sort of experimental studies, or was it all based on theoretical mathematics?
As far as I know, it was he was purely a theoretician. And except in, well, that's not necessarily true, because he had wide instruments and a wide interest in astronomy. And it wouldn't just surprise me if he had made a number of astronomical observations, but that's not something I've sort of studied in any detail. His two main interests, apart from things like earthquakes, were astronomy and magnetism, and I think possibly gravity as well.
More questions?
Just a comment. Before Mitchell, the Chinese were concerned about invaders digging under fortifications to attack a city. So they set up drums around the walls, and they would put their ears on the drums and kind of triangulate to find out where the tunnel was being dug. So it's kind of a form of triangulation. I guess it was very rude. I guess they were looking for the closest, the noise that was closest would be loudest on a particular drum.
Yeah, probably not just the Chinese, because in the sort of 17th, 16th century, probably even before that, in Europe, siege warfare, burrowing underneath the guy's walls was a common tactic. Not so much to sort of burrow under the wall and get in. The idea was that you burrowed under the wall until you were right under the wall, and then you put in barrels of gunpowder and then blew the whole thing up. And so the people who were besieged had exactly the same problem. They had to work out whether any sort of mining operations like this were going on. And if they were, then countermining would be the way. You try to intersect the other guy's tunnel and fight him underground. Similarly, of course, to what happened under the trenches on the Western Front in World War I, where you had mining and countermining, and trying to get under the enemy trench without being noticed, or noticing the enemy trying to do that and again intersecting their tunnel to defend yourself.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Roger, for that wonderful start.